My name is Madeline Harper. I'm 33 years old. Get out of here. And don't you ever call me your brother again, he hissed right after his hand slammed hard against my shoulder enough to make me stumble back a step. The wedding music faltered, then stopped altogether. Guests turned a ripple of whispers cutting through the flower-scented air. I said nothing. Surrounded by white roses and golden candlelight, I stood upright, the cold creeping from my fingertips to my throat. He is my younger brother, the groom. And the reason for this public display, I refused to lend him $2 million for a reckless business scheme. That refusal in his eyes made me the traitor in the family. Across the room, a man in a charcoal suit was watching me. His eyes were not unfamiliar. I stood there in the lavish wedding hall. No one knew where the real storm was coming from. No one knew. But they would. Because this wasn't the first time I'd been shut out of a room. But it might be the last. Come with me, to see who I truly became, and what happened to the one who once looked down on me. The hall smelled faintly of lilies, though the sweetness felt almost cloying now sticking to the back of my throat. The white tablecloths, the towering floral centerpieces, the polished crystal glasses, everything around me looked as if it had been frozen mid-breath. Only the flicker of candle flames betrayed the fact that time was still moving. I could feel eyes grazing over me like cold fingertips. Some faces carried pity, others relief that it wasn't them standing here. A few looked away entirely as if averting their gaze could erase the scene from existence. It didn't matter. None of them had ever really looked at me before, not in a way that reached beneath the surface. My shoulder still tingled where his hand had landed. Not from the force, though it had been sharp enough, but from the realization that the hand once small enough to grip mine in a crosswalk now carried enough anger to push me away. I thought about the countless moments we'd shared late-night talks when he was too scared to sleep my old car rides to get him from parties he didn't want our parents to know about. I had always been there when he called. Until tonight. A waiter passed by with a tray, slowing his pace just slightly near me. He didn't say anything, but his eyes lingered a second longer than necessary. Recognition, sympathy. Or perhaps simply curiosity, the kind that clings to people when something out of the ordinary disturbs the social order. I offered him nothing in return, just a faint nod. Across the room, the man in the charcoal suit had not looked away. His posture was measured, almost formal, but there was a stillness about him that didn't match the restless fidgeting of the other guests. I could feel his gaze like a question hanging in the air, but I kept my own eyes steady on the chandelier above the dance floor. The music didn't resume. Instead, the silence thickened until even the clinking of cutlery from the far side of the hall seemed too loud. Somewhere in the corner, my mother's voice rose in a brittle laugh, trying to patch over the rupture as though nothing had happened. She had always been quick to smooth appearances. The space around me felt both too wide and too narrow. My place card still sat neatly at the family table, its silver script gleaming under the warm light as if mocking me. There was a chair waiting there, one I wouldn't return to. Not tonight. Perhaps not ever. I could have walked out right then, but something in me resisted the obvious exit. Leaving immediately would have been too easy for him, too neat a conclusion for the watching eyes. So I stood. I let the seconds stretch my stillness, a quiet refusal. From the corner of my vision, I saw him, my brother, leaning close to his new bride. Her hand rested on his arm, her lips moving quickly, but his jaw stayed tight. His eyes did not seek me out again. That I realized told me more than any words could. I didn't feel the need to defend myself. Not here, not now. Defenses were for battles worth fighting in the open. This wasn't one of them. A small child in a pale blue suit ran past me chasing a balloon that bobbed just out of reach. For a moment, the room's tension seemed to lift, if only because people were grateful for something else to look at. I envied that kind of oblivion to exist in a space without knowing its undercurrents. Somewhere outside beyond the glass doors, I could see the night gathering over the city. The moon was thin and sharp like a blade waiting for its moment. I thought of how often the most decisive turns in life happen in silence unnoticed until their consequences arrive, like the tide. The man in the charcoal suit finally moved. Not toward me, not yet. He stepped aside for a passing guest, his hands clasped lightly behind his back, his gaze never faltering. I wondered if he had been waiting for me or if I was only imagining his interest. I shifted my weight slightly, my heels pressing into the plush carpet. The texture anchored me. I took a slow breath, tasting the air, reminding myself that no one here could take from me what truly mattered. They could write me out of their version of this night, but I had my own record, and in mine, this was not an ending. Somewhere deep inside, past the sting in my shoulder and the heat in my chest, I felt the smallest movement like the first crack of ice before spring. Not loud, not obvious, but enough to tell me something had changed. And as I stood there amid the murmur of voices and the weight of glances, I knew I would carry this moment with me. Not as a wound, but as a marker. For there are rooms you are pushed out of, and there are rooms you choose to never return to. This one was both. I was born in a small coastal town in Oregon where the winters were long and the fog seemed to blur the edges of everything, streets, houses, even people. My earliest memories are of our house perched on a hill that overlooked the water, its white paint peeling under the salt air. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, but some names carried more weight than others. Ours did, though, not because of wealth. It was reputation, a family narrative told and retold until it hardened into something unquestionable. In that narrative, my younger brother Daniel was the golden thread. Even before he could speak in full sentences, my parents called him our hope. When I was 9 and he was 5, my father once lifted him high in the air during a neighborhood barbecue and announced that Daniel would carry the Harper name further than any of us. I stood beside my mother, holding a tray of lemonade, listening, smiling as I was expected to. No one noticed the way my hand tightened around the glass pitcher. It's not that I was unloved. I was simply necessary. The reliable one, the one who could be counted on to help with homework, to fetch forgotten jackets, to keep quiet when tempers flared. My report cards were straight A's, but they were met with polite nods. Daniel's participation ribbon in a swim meet earned applause at the dinner table. I learned early that recognition in our family wasn't about achievement, it was about fitting the story they'd already written. When I left for college, the first in our family to do so, there was no send-off at the airport, just a hug from my mother and a reminder to call on Sundays. Daniel, still in high school, waved from the couch without looking away from the television. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was better off without the spotlight. For years, I kept my distance. I studied, worked, moved to cities where my name meant nothing, and that anonymity felt like freedom. But no matter how far I went, the gravity of family pulled at me. Phone calls that began with, "How are you?" would end with, "Can you help Daniel?" It was always something, a bill he'd forgotten to pay, a deadline, he'd missed a mess that needed cleaning. And I always said yes. I can't pinpoint the moment I began to feel the imbalance like a stone in my shoe. But I know it was before the wedding. Maybe it was the time I drove 4 hours in the rain to bring him the portfolio he'd left behind before a crucial meeting, the one he didn't thank me for. Maybe it was when he called at 2 a.m., drunk, asking for money to cover a debt, and my voice stayed calm even as my stomach clenched. Still, I never confronted him. Confrontation wasn't how we did things in the Harper household. We kept the surface smooth, the water undisturbed. If something was broken, we worked around it rather than fixing it. I became fluent in silence, the kind that says more than words ever could. When Daniel told me about his latest business venture, his voice was bright, fast-paced, full of the kind of confidence that leaves no room for questions. He spoke of investors' market timing, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Then came the number 2 million. I listened without interrupting. My instinct, honed over years of reading between lines, told me more than his pitch ever could. There were holes, risks, and something darker, something he didn't name. I told him no, quietly, firmly, the way you might close a door before the wind can catch it. He laughed, at first thinking I was joking. Then his voice sharpened. "After everything I've done for you," he asked, though the ledger between us had never tilted in his direction. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I felt the shift. calls went unanswered. My mother's tone cooled, her words clipped. My father, who rarely called me at all, phoned once not to ask about my health, my work, or my life, but to suggest in that slow, deliberate way of his that perhaps I reconsider my decision for the sake of family harmony. I didn't reconsider. I arrived at the wedding knowing I was no longer the quiet ally they'd counted on, but I hadn't expected the rupture to be so public, so deliberate. That was Daniel's choice, a performance meant to signal to everyone present that I was no longer welcome in the family narrative. It worked. In the hours after, while guests clinked glasses and danced under the chandelier, I wandered the edges of the hall. People avoided my eyes. The ones who did meet my gaze offered polite, strained smiles. I left without saying goodbye, my heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that matched the beat of something new forming inside me. That night, alone in my hotel room, I sat by the window watching the ocean swallow the moonlight. I thought about all the years I had given without asking for anything in return. I thought about how easily I had been pushed out, how little it seemed to cost them. And I realized it wasn't that I had been cut from the family's story. I had simply outgrown it. 3 weeks before the wedding, Daniel called me in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. I was standing in my kitchen slicing an apple when his name lit up the screen. I almost didn't answer, not out of avoidance, but because I already knew what the call would be. My brother didn't call just to talk. "Got a minute?" He began, his voice too cheerful to be casual. I could hear noise in the background, the kind you hear in busy cafes. Voices, the hiss of an espresso machine, the clink of cups. He didn't waste time. "I've got this opportunity. Big, solid. Just need a partner to get it off the ground. 2 million. That's all." I set the knife down, pressing the flat of my palm against the cool counter. "Daniel, that's not a small number." "It is for you," he said quickly, a chuckle in his tone that wasn't quite humor. "Come on, Maddie. You know I'll pay you back. I've never let you down before." I thought about correcting him, reminding him of the debts that had quietly gone unpaid, the favors never returned. But what would be the point? In his mind, the balance sheet had always been in his favor. "Not this time," I said. No anger, no hesitation. There was a pause. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm not lending you the money." His sigh was sharp, the kind that cuts. "I'm your brother." "I know." Silence again. Then more quietly. "After everything I've done for you." He let the words hang, confident they would carry weight. They didn't. The call ended shortly after, but the shift had already begun. My mother called the next day. Her voice was polite, almost formal, as if speaking to someone she didn't want to offend but didn't trust either. "You might reconsider," she said, "for the sake of peace." My father's message came the day after that, a single sentence in his usual measured tone. "Think about the bigger picture." He didn't define what the bigger picture was. He never had to. In our family, bigger picture always meant Daniel. I stayed quiet. Silence has its own kind of strength, though it's often mistaken for surrender. The week before the wedding, I attended a small family dinner meant for inner circle only. I wasn't surprised to find my seat at the far end of the table. The conversation flowed around me like I was an obstacle in a stream. Daniel avoided my eyes, but when he finally spoke directly to me, it was with a smile too wide to be genuine. Still set on saying no, he asked, voice light enough that the others could pretend it was a joke. "Yes?" I said. For a moment his expression flickered. Then he laughed, a short, sharp sound that didn't reach his eyes. It was in that flicker, that thin crack in his performance, that I felt something shift in me. Not anger, not hurt. Something quieter, heavier, a reminder. Because while Daniel had his version of the bigger picture, I had my own one that spanned further than he could imagine. Years ago, I had been part of a project where the stakes were measured not in dollars, but in lives. I had been trusted then with resources, information, and responsibilities that Daniel wouldn't believe if I told him. My name had once been spoken in rooms where every word was recorded, every decision documented in codes. But none of that existed in the Harper family narrative. I said nothing about it. I never would. At the rehearsal dinner the night before the wedding, the distance was no longer subtle. I watched Daniel work the room like a politician, shaking hands, laughing loudly, his arm around his bride. When he passed me, he didn't stop. The people around him didn't either. It was as if I had become invisible. Later that evening, as I stood near the exit, my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize, but one I had once known by heart, appeared on the screen. No name, just a message. "Are you available to talk?" I didn't respond immediately. My gaze drifted across the room to Daniel, who was lifting a toast. His voice carried over the clinking of glasses. That message stayed in my mind all night. The sender had been part of my life during a time when precision and discipline mattered more than sentiment. I hadn't heard from them in years. If they were reaching out now, it wasn't for small talk. At the wedding, the rest played out as it did the push the words, the quiet excommunication. But as I stood in that silence, my phone was still in my clutch, that unanswered message sitting like a sealed envelope waiting for the right moment to open. When the night ended and I walked out of the hall into the cold air, I finally replied with 2 words: "I'm listening." The morning after the wedding, I woke with the sensation that someone had rearranged the furniture in my head. I knew the shapes of things, but not their places. The hotel room was too bright. Light leaked around the blackout curtains in razor-thin lines, carving the air into quiet pieces. My shoulder ached where Daniel's hand had landed. I pressed my palm there as if I could flatten the memory back into the skin and make it stay. I lay still for a long time, listening to the soft machinery of the room, the hum of the vent, the faint rattle in the pipes, the elevator cables sighing behind the wall. Small sounds, all of them indifferent to the particular failures of a family. The phone lay face down on the nightstand. I didn't reach for it. I told myself I was resting. It felt closer to hiding. When I finally stood, the mirror offered a version of me I didn't quite recognize, hair-loosened eyes, tired but alert, as if a sentinel had been posted behind them and refused to sleep. I made coffee and drank it black, the heat settling into my chest. I thought about the wedding hall, about the $2 million that had become a border drawn in a single sentence. I thought about my mother's laugh and my father's silence, about Daniel's voice, the way it had sharpened when I said no, the way it turned on me as if I had violated a treaty he'd never named. Doubt moved through me like fog, heavy and without edges. Maybe I could have found a different way to say it. Maybe I should have talked to him earlier when the first hints of the scheme surfaced. Maybe I had been too rigid, too careful. Maybe. The word opened doors that led nowhere. I showered, dressed, and packed slowly. In the lobby, a man at the desk asked if my stay had been pleasant. I said yes, and heard how unconvincing the words sounded in my mouth. Outside, the air had a clean bite to it. I walked without destination, the suitcase wheels murmuring against the pavement. The city was rinsed in winter light, honest, unflattering. At a corner cafe, I took a table facing the street and kept my coat on. I ordered nothing for 10 minutes, then finally asked for tea just to justify the chair. The phone lay on the table, face up now, dark and reflective. When it came alive, it startled me, a short vibration, a single line on the lock screen call, when ready. No name, no number displayed. A familiar discretion. I stared at it without touching it. I could let it pass. I could decide that last night's 2 words, "I'm listening," belonged to a person I was no longer willing to be. I could, in the simplest terms, disappear. The thought had a strange sweetness to it, like letting a wave close over your head and surrendering to the pressure. The tea arrived. I wrapped my hands around the cup and watched condensation fog the glass. A child pressed his face to the window, then laughed and ran to catch someone's hand. The ordinary world moved on without me. There was relief in that, and a small grief. I turned the phone and unlocked it. A second message had queued while I wavered. Brief, incoming. Secure, channel. The link appeared a moment later, blunt and familiar. My breath lengthened, not quite a sigh, not quite relief. The rhythm of my days, once measured by these kinds of interruptions, had gone quiet for years. The muscle memory was still there, patient as a dog at a door. Back in the hotel business center, neutral carpet, neutral art, neutral air. I requested a private booth and logged into a portal whose steps my fingers remembered before my mind did. Two-factor, then a third factor that didn't announce itself as such. The interface hid its urgency behind restraint. Small fonts, muted colors, nothing to invite attention from anyone who didn't already know what to look for. The brief was titled with a date and an innocuous string like a grocery list item in another language. I scanned. A financial node in a secondary jurisdiction, irregular transaction patterns radiating from three shell entities, a sudden increase in velocity, then a silence suggestive not of rest, but of preparation. Names I didn't know, routes I recognized, and a short list of questions with their edges sanded down. Are these signals noise? Are we late? What remains unaccounted for? I felt the weight of it settle. The old doubt shifted, made room for a different kind. Not about myself this time, but about timing. If the data was right, someone was building a channel for funds that would move quickly and disappear into ground that we'd been mapping for years. The pattern pulsed behind my eyes, the way certain constellations reappear once you learn where to look. A message popped in the corner of the screen. If willing, send first pass by 1800 Z. Short, high signal. Your eyes only. The polite fiction of choice. It made me smile. I checked the time, calculated the hours left, and reached for the blank document. For a while, I typed nothing. I let the structure assemble itself without language headings, like scaffolding placeholders for evidence a space to articulate uncertainty without apologizing for it. When the words came, they were spare. I flagged 3 anomalies that were not quite symmetrical, annotated 2 blind spots that would appeal to anyone hoping to vanish for a while, and added a line only someone who had stood inside the machinery would think to include, assume the absence of noise is engineered. Halfway through my shoulder began to throb again. I ignored it. I also ignored the part of my mind replaying the wedding in fragments, the music stopping the breath caught in people's throats the moment my brother looked at me and saw not a person, but an obstacle. I didn't push the images away. I just let them dim behind the work until they became background, like the vents hum. By 1640 Z, I had something clean enough to send and honest enough to improve. I read it out loud once in a whisper, listening for any sentence that sounded like a performance. I cut 2 lines. I added one, if window closes, expect a pivot to domestic banks with weaker internal controls. Watch for sudden compliance theater with mismatched timestamps. The phrase had the right narrowness. It would tell the right person what to test. I encrypted the document and attached it to a message so short it looked like a mistake. I waited for the countermeasure prompt, then watched the progress bar creep to completion. When the green checkmark landed, I felt the invisible thread between my life and that other world pull taut again, not choking, not even constricting, just present. Then the quiet came back bigger than before. I sat there with it aware of the ridiculousness of crying in a business center cubicle and also of how close I was to doing it. I didn't. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the ache move through me without making a home. There are griefs you have to carry without ceremony. This was one of them. The reply arrived at 1711 Z received. Exactly what we needed. Stand by for tasking. No signature which said more than any name could. I felt the smallest thread of steadiness stitch itself along my spine. Praise doesn't fix anything but accuracy does. I logged out, cleared the session, and stepped back into the hallway. A housekeeping cart creaked past. A man in a suit argued softly into his phone about timelines. The elevator doors opened with that small gasp buildings make when they're relieved of a burden. On the street, the light had shifted toward late afternoon yellow, giving way to something cooler. I walked without rushing. Doubt did not vanish. It sat beside me on a bench in a small park 2 blocks from the hotel and kept its counsel. But it had changed shape. It no longer questioned whether saying no to Daniel had been cruel. It asked only whether the cost had been necessary. I let the question sit. Some answers are earned by time alone. The phone buzzed again, a calendar block without a label, a time, and a secure link. I didn't click it yet. I watched a dog chase a leaf until the leaf surrendered and lay still, then watched the dog lose interest and trot back to its owner. The ordinary world continued its small negotiations. When I finally stood, the sky had thinned to a pale steel. I could feel under the ache and the fatigue a line of motion forming, not a surge, not a battle cry, just a decision moving toward weight. I went back to the hotel, packed the last of my things, and left the key on the desk. In the taxi, the driver asked where to. I gave him an address I hadn't said out loud in years and listened to how steady it sounded. As we merged into traffic, I rested my head against the cool window and let the city smear into soft lines. I did not feel strong. I felt accurate, and for now, accuracy was enough to keep me from disappearing. The address I had given the taxi driver was a building most people in the city walked past without noticing. A square, anonymous structure with a narrow glass entrance and no visible signage. It could have been a dental office or an accounting firm. That was the point. Inside, the air was cooler, drier, and carried that faint trace of metal that always seemed to follow secure spaces. The receptionist didn't ask my name, just handed me a key card with a green sticker in the corner and pointed toward the elevators. I took the ride to the 6th floor where the hallway was lined with closed doors, each marked only by a number. Mine was 614. The key card gave a muted beep and the lock clicked. The room was not large, a table, 2 chairs, a monitor mounted on the wall, and a phone with no keypad. A single window looked out over the street, the blinds half drawn. On the table was a thin folder, cream-colored, stamped in red, with a word that could have meant almost anything to someone outside. Inside it meant urgency. The briefing was concise, stripped of anything unnecessary. 3 high-net-worth accounts across different jurisdictions, each moving funds in a pattern that at first looked random but began to form an outline if you knew where to stand. Transfers were routed through entities designed to vanish short-lived shells with directors who didn't exist outside of paperwork. 2 of the accounts had ties to an organization I'd seen once before years ago in a case that had ended with arrests in 3 countries. The 3rd account was new. A small notation at the bottom caught my eye, potential domestic pivot confirmation needed. It wasn't the words that struck me, but the handwriting. I knew it. Precise, slanted a fraction more pressure on the downstrokes. Whoever had written it knew I would see it. I took out my notebook, black unmarked, and began to map the connections. I didn't need the internet for this, just memory and the discipline of not trusting the first pattern you think you see. I drew the lines in pencil, letting them smudge, testing alternate routes until one configuration began to hold. Halfway through, the phone on the table lit up. No ringtone, just a steady green light. I picked it up. "Confirming you've seen the domestic note," the voice said. It was male-clipped with the kind of calm that comes from working too long in rooms where panic was a liability. "I've seen it," I said. "We're tasking you to lead the review. Minimal team remote coordination. Your discretion applies." That last part, "your discretion applies," was both permission and warning. I understood it as, no one above will intervene unless you fail. "I'll need a secure relay," I said. "It's already open." The line clicked dead. I began building the task list in my head, names to query jurisdictions to prioritize points where their compliance facade might break under the right kind of pressure. There was no thrill in it, just precision. This was the work I knew, the kind that didn't require speeches, only accuracy and timing. By evening, I had a skeleton plan, 3 analysts each in different cities, none aware of the others. One would work the corporate registry angle, digging for directors who appeared and vanished in suspicious cycles. Another would track transaction timestamps against known operational windows. The 3rd would probe for mismatched jurisdictional filings, the small cracks where speed and secrecy start to conflict. I sent each of them only what they needed: numbers, dates, a thin slice of context, no names. The less they knew, the cleaner the line stayed. While I worked the room outside, my focus faded: the hum of the ventilation, the shuffle of someone's shoes in the hallway, the distant muffled ding of the elevator. I kept my pace steady, knowing speed without accuracy was just noise. At 21:17, the first data fragment came in. A director's name tied to 2 dissolved entities, both with the same physical address in a part of the city no one reputable would keep an office. The timestamp on the dissolution was curious one day after a large transfer hit the account. It was too neat. The second analyst's packet confirmed the mismatched three transactions labeled as internal, but executed through an external processor. That kind of slippage left a trail, even if faint. By 2304, the third piece landed a set of filings so sloppy it was almost deliberate, as if someone wanted us to see them but not act fast enough. I had seen this move before. It was meant to waste cycles, make you chase the obvious while the real shift happened elsewhere. I stepped back from the table and looked at the map I'd sketched. The lines formed a loop, now not a web money cycling back toward a point that didn't exist yet on paper. That was the pivot. They weren't just moving funds offshore. They were preparing to bring it back in through a domestic channel they could control. I wrote the conclusion in 6 words, window narrowing. Domestic pivot in motion. I encrypted the packet, routed it through the relay, and locked my notebook in the cabinet under the table. As I stood to leave, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. It looked like someone else entirely, not the woman at the wedding, not the sister pushed aside. This version had no stake in family politics. Her only loyalty was to the work. Downstairs, the street was nearly empty. The air was sharp, and the city lights bled softly into the low clouds. I walked without hurry, the keycard in my pocket, and the sound of my own steps steady in my ears. Somewhere Daniel was likely still celebrating, unaware that within a week, the kind of money he dreamed of moving might be trapped in place. I didn't plan to tell him. I didn't plan to tell anyone. The satisfaction wasn't in him knowing. It was in knowing myself that even when the ground shifted under my feet, I could still draw a clean line from problem to resolution without letting the noise in. Back in my apartment, I didn't turn on the main lights. I sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and watched the relay timer count down until the next check-in. Between the quiet ticks, I felt the same calm I used to find in early morning briefings before the day had the chance to fracture. It wasn't vindication. It wasn't revenge. It was the knowledge that while Daniel measured strength in visible displays, mine lived in rooms he would never be invited into. The next message arrived just past midnight. Good read. Prepare to brief senior tomorrow. Direct line. I closed the laptop. Outside, the street was empty, the windows across the way, dark. I leaned back in my chair, the edge of the keycard still pressing against my palm, and let the stillness settle. This was the strategy. Not noise, not spectacle. Just the quiet accumulation of leverage piece by piece until the shape of the whole could no longer be ignored. 1 week after the wedding, the city hosted a winter charity gala in a glass atrium overlooking the river. The invitations weren't exclusive, just expensive, which meant the room held everyone who liked to be seen: donors, executives, local officials in careful suits. Light pooled on the marble floor, the kind of brightness that erases flaws. A quartet played something elegant enough to make conversations sound more refined than they were. I hadn't planned to attend. My name had been on the list long before the wedding, and after the briefings after the relay, it felt simpler to show up than to explain my absence to anyone who might be paying attention. I wore black, not as a statement, but as cover. In a room like this, invisibility comes from fitting the pattern. Daniel was there. Of course he was. He moved through the entrance with his bride at his side, the kind of couple people unconsciously make space for. He had the glow of someone who still believed the future would arrive on his terms. When he saw me, his face didn't change. He'd already rewritten his version of last week. In that draft, I no longer existed. I found a place near the railing where the river looked like a long, dark ribbon and let the sound of the room pass through me. I had a briefing in the morning. The domestic pivot was confirmed, the window narrow. The timing almost finished arranging itself. Accuracy had replaced doubt so thoroughly that my shoulders' ache felt like an old story I didn't need to revisit. Near the bar, Daniel lifted his glass to a cluster of men I recognized by type, if not by name, the ambitious ones whose business cards promised more than their ledgers could support. His bride touched his sleeve when a server passed with canapes. The small choreography of a couple learning each other in public. I turned my glass slowly on the railing, leaving a faint circle of condensation, and let my eyes settle on the reflection in the window instead of the room itself. Across that blurred pane, a movement resolved the man in the charcoal suit. He wasn't far, just beyond the nearest column, speaking quietly to someone whose back was to me. He looked exactly as he had at the wedding, composed, economical, not performing for anyone. Our eyes didn't meet. They didn't need to. At 8:30, the quartet paused. The event director stepped to a low stage and began the sequence of thanks that holds these nights together. Names, sponsors, a brief mention of the foundation's work. Polite applause. I listened the way you listen to rain through a closed window, aware but distant. Then, somewhere to my left, something small and human interrupted the smoothness. A credit card machine chirped and refused to charge. The bartender tried again. The machine chirped again, louder this time, in the pocket of quiet after applause. Heads turned in that angle people use when they want to watch without being seen watching. Daniel stood at the bar, the posture of someone who does not expect obstacles. The bartender kept his voice low, words hidden by the hum of the room, but the shape of the exchange was unmistakable. Try another card. Try a different terminal. Hold on. One moment. A manager appeared, then a second. The bride's smile stayed in place, then thinned. It is strange how quickly air changes when money refuses to move. Conversations didn't stop, but they developed a second layer, a listening for what might happen next. The card machine chirped a third time. Daniel's jaw tightened. He reached into his jacket for his phone, glanced at the screen, glanced again as if a second look might rearrange the numbers into something friendlier. In my reflection, the man in the charcoal suit shifted. He stepped out from the column and crossed the floor without haste. As he approached, the small hum around the bar became a silence with edges. The manager straightened. Daniel tried on a laugh that didn't fit, said something I couldn't hear, then said it again, with fewer words. I did not move. The river kept its slow, disciplined glide under the glass. I watched the scene the way you watch a monitor in a dark room, present but removed enough to keep the frame intact. The man in the charcoal suit stopped first at the bar. He spoke to the manager, then to the bartender, his voice pitched low enough that it didn't carry, but the posture of the people around him changed. Shoulders unhitched. The manager nodded and disappeared toward a side door. The suit didn't look at Daniel yet. He waited. That patience worked through the room like a corrective. When he finally turned, he didn't offer a hand. He offered a small, neutral nod, the kind that acknowledges another person's existence without granting them equal footing. Daniel tried a greeting anyway, turning it into a complaint halfway through. The suit listened without visible reaction. The phone in Daniel's hand lit again. He looked. Whatever he saw took color out of his face by degrees. The event director, sensing the room's attention tipping, asked the quartet to resume. Music returned, thin at first, then fuller. People tried to drape their conversations over the disruption. It didn't work. The air had already learned a new shape. The suit left the bar and walked toward me. Not directly, nothing so dramatic, but with the curved path of someone navigating through a crowded room without touching anyone. He stopped at the railing a measured distance away and rested his hand lightly on the metal as if to mirror mine. For a heartbeat, we stood like strangers admiring a view. "Ms. Harper," he said, just loud enough for the two nearest clusters to hear, without feeling addressed. "Thank you for your time this week." It was not a flourish. It was not a performance. It was a sentence that carried the weight of a context no one else in the room possessed. Heads turned. The nearest clusters went quiet. I inclined my head. I didn't offer words. The silence between us did the work. He waited a second longer than courtesy requires a signal only to me, then added, "We'll proceed as outlined." Another small nod, and he moved on, not toward the exit, not back to the bar, but into the ordinary flow of the room, where he dissolved as if he'd never been singular at all. Around us, sound returned, altered in frequency. A woman near the railing watched me with the practiced curiosity of someone who knows people worth knowing. A man beside her recalibrated his expression to something closer to respect. The quartet climbed into a brighter passage, trying to lift the room with them. I sipped my drink. The river held its line. At the bar, Daniel stood a fraction apart from the people he'd been entertaining. His bride touched his arm, then let her hand fall when he didn't respond. The manager had returned from the side door and was speaking in the careful cadence of someone delivering a message he cannot adjust. Daniel's phone lit again and again. He didn't swipe this time. He stared at the screen like it might blink first. No one announced anything. There were no raised voices, no gestures large enough to anchor a story you could tell later without embellishment. The shape of the evening did not break. It simply shifted around a quiet fact. Access had changed hands. A man I recognized from the local paper made his way toward me, then thought better of it when he caught the residual angle of the charcoal suit's attention still resting on where I had been. He adjusted his course, stopped a safe distance away, and admired the river instead. People are quick learners when the lesson is proximity. My glass was empty. I set it on the railing and left no trace but a ring of water that faded almost immediately. As I turned, I passed close enough to the bar to hear a single sentence, the manager's voice steady and apologetic. "I'm afraid the account is temporarily unavailable." Daniel's reply was softer than I expected. Not rage, not denial, just a quiet, incredulous, "That can't be right." I kept walking. I didn't look at him. The doors opened with their small mechanical breath, and the cold folded in clean and precise. Outside, the river lifted a silver edge under the streetlights. Somewhere behind me, music flourished. Somewhere behind me, a story adjusted to accommodate a new center of gravity. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated. The work was not a weapon to use on my brother, even if it intersected with him for a moment. It was a map I knew how to read, and tonight, the coordinates aligned in public. On the sidewalk, my phone buzzed once, a single initial and a time. The kind of message that confirms motion without announcing destination. I slid the phone back into my coat. A couple passed laughing at nothing important. A taxi slowed, then continued when I didn't raise my hand. Behind the glass, the room glowed on without me. Inside, they would reconstruct the night according to their comfort, a glitch at the bar, a brief oddness, the return of music. But some of them would remember the sentence spoken at the railing the way the man in the charcoal suit said my name. They wouldn't know what it meant. They would only know that it mattered. I walked toward the corner where the city thinned into dark. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The confrontation had already happened in the only language that counted there, recognition delivered without spectacle sealed by silence. And when silence does its work well, it leaves nothing to argue with. 2 days after the gala, my name appeared in print for the first time in years. Not on the front page, not in bold, but in the smaller column where certain stories are placed, so they can be found by those who are meant to find them. The article was about the Financial Integrity Task Group, a cooperative unit that most people outside certain circles had never heard of. The language was measured, stripped of detail, but precise enough for anyone reading between the lines. It spoke of an operation concluded the previous week, accounts frozen in multiple jurisdictions, a domestic channel preempted before it could activate, and an estimated sum in excess of $200 million prevented from entering illicit use. The paragraph near the end mentioned strategic analysis provided by an independent consultant with prior clearance. It didn't name me outright. It didn't need to. Inside the network, names are currency, and mine had just moved again. That morning, I stood at my kitchen counter with coffee cooling in my hand and read the article twice. I knew which sentences had been rewritten, which omissions were deliberate. The piece gave the public almost nothing, but to those in the room, it was as clear as coordinates. By noon, my secure inbox held 7 messages. 3 were acknowledgments from people I hadn't worked with in years. 2 were requests for future availability. 1 was a line of numbers I recognized as an old reference code, the kind that only resurfaces when someone wants to remind you they remember. The last was from the man in the charcoal suit, clear result. No further action needed. Well done. I closed the laptop and set it aside. That afternoon, I had lunch at a quiet place near the waterfront, the kind of restaurant where tables are spaced far enough that you can think between bites. I didn't expect company, but halfway through the meal, I saw Daniel through the glass, standing on the sidewalk. His coat was unbuttoned, his hair disheveled in a way he'd once have called effortless, but now looked accidental. He didn't come in immediately. He watched for a moment, his gaze moving over the room until it landed on me. I kept my fork in my hand, my posture easy. Eventually, he opened the door and walked toward my table, pausing just before the last step. "Can I sit?" he asked. I gestured toward the empty chair. He didn't order anything. For a while, he just looked at the table at the neat square of folded napkin in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I remembered from the wedding. They froze my accounts. I didn't respond. They said it's an investigation, that they can't give me details. His hands rested flat on the table, fingers splayed. Do you know anything about it? The air between us was thin. I thought about lying, then decided even that was giving the question too much weight. You'll have to ask them, I said. He exhaled a short, frustrated sound. I'm just saying it's strange timing. First you cut me off, then this happens. I lifted my coffee cup, let the steam drift between us. Not everything revolves around you, Daniel. His mouth tightened. For a moment, I thought he might leave. Instead, he leaned back, crossing his arms. I heard someone talking at the gala. About you. Something about strategy or operations. I didn't catch it all. I let the silence stay. You're not going to tell me he asked. No, I said. He looked at me for a long time, as if trying to rearrange me into a shape that made sense in his story. But the shapes didn't fit anymore. Eventually, he pushed back his chair. Fine, he said. No handshake, no goodbye. He left the way he had come, coat flaring behind him. When the door closed, I turned back to my plate. The food was cooling, but I ate anyway. The next day, my father called. It was brief, as his calls always were. I saw your name, he said, in the paper. I waited. Didn't realize you were still involved in that kind of thing. I am. He cleared his throat. Well, good work. The phrase sounded foreign, coming from him like a suit cut in the wrong size. Before I could answer, he ended the call. The following week, during a closed-door session at a government building whose windows didn't open, I was asked to give a retrospective on the operation. The people in the room weren't strangers, though I hadn't seen most of them in years. They addressed me without titles the way you do when rank is understood without being displayed. I kept the debrief clean timelines, pivot points, predictive gaps. No embellishments, no extra weight on the parts where my choices had mattered most. They didn't need persuasion. They needed accuracy. When it was done, the chair of the session nodded once. That will be all, Ms. Harper. Outside in the hallway, I paused near a window overlooking the city. The light was pale, the streets narrow from this height. Somewhere below, life moved in its usual shapes. Cars, in lanes, people crossing at lights, conversations at cafe tables. All of it oblivious to the work that had just been concluded. That was as it should be. I knew the story Daniel would tell about the accounts about the wedding about me. It would be smaller than the truth shaped to fit the frame he could carry. I didn't need to correct it. The real record was already written elsewhere in reports with classifications no one in my family would ever see. In those pages, my role was not sister or daughter. It was analyst, strategist, operative words that required no apology, no justification. I left the building without ceremony, my coat collar turned up against the wind. On the steps, a man passing by held the door open for me without looking up from his phone. I thanked him. He didn't hear me. That was fine. Recognition was not the point. In the weeks that followed, the city softened at the edges. Winter's hard light gave way to a gauze of late frost, and the river loosened its grip on the banks. I kept my morning's simple coffee, a quiet walk before the streets learned their noise. A notebook opened on the kitchen table, not because I needed it, but because the blankness had become a kind of ritual. I wrote little, mostly small coordinates of days, a street name, a sentence heard in passing a question pared down until it fit on a line. Work receded to its natural depth. The relay quieted, which is how you know the machine is running properly. The people whose names do not appear in newspapers returned to their invisible orbits. I attended 2 briefings that required nothing more than judgment and a steady hand. Passed on one that wanted a performance dressed as urgency. I have learned to say no in ways that do not leave fingerprints. My phone rang less. The calls that did arrive were clean, a scheduling block, a request to review a line of logic, a confirmation that the window we'd closed would remain closed. The absence of noise is its own music. After years of learning how to listen for the wrong frequencies, the quiet can feel like a luxury. Family adjusted in the only way it knows, by not addressing the fracture directly. My mother left a voicemail that included whether a recipe and the phrase, "when you have time." My father sent a photograph of the coastline from our old town, the caption a single word. Still, Daniel did not call. He wouldn't not yet not, while the edges of his story were still sharp to the touch. I didn't expect an apology. I didn't require one. On a Sunday afternoon, I drove to the coast anyway. The highway unspooled like an old film familiar scenes, arriving on cue the diner that changed owners, but not menu, the bend in the road where the ocean reveals itself all at once and steals the breath without asking. I parked at the overlook where we used to stop when we were children and leaned against the rail. The air tasted like iron and salt. Below, gulls stitched their careful arcs through wind that would have unmade anyone less practiced. I thought about rooms. The ones you are invited into, the ones you are pushed out of, the ones you build, because neither invitation nor exile will do. The wedding hall had been one kind, all light and spectacle, a place where meaning was formatted to be photographed. The briefings another, windowless and precise, where language is engineered to travel through time intact. My kitchen, with its quiet table and kettle that breathes just before it sings, is a third. There's power in knowing which room you're in and which one you need. An elderly couple sat on the far bench, sharing a thermos and a silence that looked well worn. The woman smiled as if we shared a harmless secret that the ocean is most honest when no one is demanding anything from it. I stayed until the horizon dropped the sun into a single molten seam and then let the dark come up without dramatics. Back home, I opened the file cabinet and reordered a few folders, not because it was necessary, but because order is a kindness you can offer your future self. In a drawer below, I placed my brother's wedding invitation, the paper thick, the font ornate beside a smaller card, with a date and a room number printed in sans serif. Two versions of a life, neither the whole story. I closed the drawer. I began teaching again, though I never call it that. Once a week, in a room borrowed from a library branch on the quieter side of the city, I meet with 6 people who have chosen an unglamorous kind of acuity. They're not obvious. That is the point. We talk about how to think in layers, how to write, so that the important sentence is the one that slides past without a flourish, how to test a pattern until you are certain it is not the first pattern you hoped to see. I do not tell them stories about operations. I teach them how to bear responsibility without using it to make themselves bigger. On one of those evenings after the class had emptied and the room's hum had flattened into the kind of quiet that carries only the air conditioner's patient breath, a student lingered. She was young in the way that lets a person believe they have infinite drafts left to write. "How do you know," she asked, "when to stay in a room that doesn't want you?" "You don't," I said. "You test the hinges. If they creak for you, stay and oil them. If they don't, measure the walls and build elsewhere." She wrote it down like it might be useful later. Perhaps it will be. News trickled back about Daniel in fragments that asked nothing of me. An acquaintance mentioned he was taking time the way people do when they mean someone is learning the shape of a consequence. A former colleague of his bumping into me near the courthouse steps said rough patch and tried to make his face arrange itself into compassion. The bank notices found their way to the right desks. Compliance theater gave way to compliance. I didn't need the details. I understood the arc. On a different afternoon, I ran into my father outside a hardware store. He was holding a bundle of stakes and a coil of twine, the tools of a man planning to insist on order where the ground keeps shifting. We stood for a moment in a weather that couldn't decide. He asked if I had eaten. I said not yet. We bought 2 coffees that tasted like cardboard and sat on a curb as if neither of us remembered we owned chairs. He told me about a neighbor's fence, about how winter had pushed it a degree it could not afford, about replacing boards one at a time so the whole wouldn't collapse. He did not ask about my work. I did not offer. When we stood to go, he touched my shoulder in the old way and said, "You know where we are," which is the closest he will ever come to saying, "You belong when you decide you do." It was enough. I have stopped measuring strength by who stays. I measure it by what remains steady when I choose to move. The rooms I keep now are small by design and large in function: my kitchen table, the library classroom, a windowless office that barely exists until the keycard wakes it. In each, the center is the work, the good kind, the kind that leaves the world a fraction more exact than it found it. Every so often at the end of a day that kept its shape, I walk to the bridge and count the lights stitched along the river. I think about the people whose names I will never know who kept their hands steady at the right moment, and about the people who will never know mine. There is dignity in that, a relief from the tyranny of recognition. I do not ask my brother for anything. I do not ask my family to rewrite their story. If they want to meet me where I am, the map is simple and unadorned. If they don't, the map still works. I am not waiting in a doorway anymore. I am not pressing my ear to a wall to prove I can hear what happens on the other side. The measure of a life is not the rooms that would not hold you. It is the architecture you learn to raise when the blueprint is yours alone to draw, quietly, precisely, without audience. I set another chair at my kitchen table, not for guests, but for the work itself, the questions that arrive without apology, the decisions that choose their own weight. The kettle breathes. The pen waits as if it never doubted I would return. Outside, the city settles its evening arguments and concedes to the dark. Inside, there is light where I need it and no more. I place my palms flat on the wood, feel the grain's patient map under skin, and let the room find its level. When they didn't give me a seat in that room, I built my own command center.